بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الثناء وأتم التسليم وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. نويت التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم والدعاء على الهدى والدلالة على الخير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله ومرضاته والثواب وقربه سبحانه وتعالى. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most gracious, the most merciful, and we begin by sending abundant peace and blessings and salawat upon our beloved sallallahu alayhi wa sahbihi wa sallam, and beginning with the intention to remind and to be reminded, to teach and to learn, to give benefit and to receive benefit, and to call other people to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sunnah of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and begin with every intention that our teachers begin with and every intention that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the last class, we talked about the chapters of assisting the oppressed. Right? We talked about the obligation in everything from our daily life and everything that we consume to the countries that we live in, to our brothers and sisters around the world. How do we do that? And the chapter after that, we talked about keeping promises and the status that holds in terms of keeping an oath that is made in Islam. And then after that, we began talking about humility. We'll begin, inshallah, this class very briefly recapping and closing that chapter and then continuing. And so the author says, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, that we talked about the ayah of وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا, that the servants of Ar-Rahman, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the people that are servants of, one of my most beautiful names, Ar-Rahman, of the most merciful, are the people who خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ, when people respond to them or act towards them with ignorance, they respond and say قَالُوا سَلَامًا, that they respond with peace. And he continues and he says that just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised to raise the people of humility, He has also promised to lower the arrogant and to abase them in this life and in the next. And so there's a very subtle lesson here, and this is something that anybody who falls for this trap of shaitan, that they're amongst the most foolish of people, because we see it happen to everyone around us. Right? So it's not like it's happening for the first time, but rather you see it happening and you still walk into that trap. And that trap is the trap of ostentation, right? Ujub, and pride, and thinking of yourself to be someone, whether it's in a worldly sense or in a spiritual or a religious sense. And that's arguably more dangerous, that you claim or that you even think that you hold a higher rank than somebody else spiritually, or that you look down on someone else who may, struggle with something like drinking, or who may struggle with something that you're not struggling with. And that's purely by the fadl or the ni'mah of Allah. And we don't look down upon anyone, but rather we hate the sin, but not the person. And that's what our teachers tell us. And he continues and he says that in the Quran, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that truly He does not love the arrogant. And we see this all throughout the Quran, that the people Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala claims, it's a very strong claim that He is making, that He does not like or love are the people who are arrogant, either towards Him or towards other people. If arrogance is firmly embedded in someone's heart, its effect will be apparent in their haughtiness, in their pride, and in the way that they walk with their head held high. It will also be evident, amongst other things, in their disdain for sitting with the poor and their aversion to sitting at the back of a gathering or to dress modestly. Now this is really powerful, because what he's saying is it will be shown in both the explicit outward, right? People who clearly look down on other people, right? People who, the way that they walk or the way that they perceive themselves. And we know in some of the other stories, both in the Quran and in the books of history, right? There were only a handful of times that a child ever spoke, like a baby, very recently after its birth in Islam. These were miracles, right? We know of Isa alayhi salam. One of them was that one of the other miracles of another time was that there was a child who was with his mother, and the mother saw a very poor person walking basically with like rags and like totally humiliated, right? Had no level of honor in her eyes, right? And they had nothing to their name, and they were very destitute. And the mother looks at that person and she says, Ya Allah, I pray, I make dua that you never allow my son to ever be like this person. So what does she do? She sees a person who is basically poor or in poverty, a person who's humiliated, and she says, Ya Allah, I ask you to never make my son like this person. And moments later, another person comes by. In some narrations, I believe they say, on a horse, right? And this is somebody who's very majestic, right? Somebody who's honorable, who has his head held high. He's clearly a wealthy person. And the mother is impressed, and she says, Ya Allah, I have asked you to make my son like this person. And the child speaks, and he says, Ya Allah, I ask you to make me like the first person, and never to make me like the second person. And the mother is astounded, right? She says, she looks at him, this is her infant who's speaking. And then when she learns the wisdom of this, she realizes, and this is from her own son, that the first person was somebody who was beloved and close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because even in that poverty, this was somebody who was always turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and had a special place with him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the second person was somebody who was arrogant and someone who was proud of himself. And this was somebody who was hated, right? Or you know, that's a strong word, but somebody who was disliked, right? More so his mannerisms were disliked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so the child didn't want to be like that. And this is again one of the miracles that teaches us one of these lessons of what we aspire towards. And everything, we see this today, right? In the way that we approach marriage, in the way that we approach our friendships, in the way that we even approach our families, right? Sometimes the people who have less to their name, the people who don't even hold, you know, the family gatherings sometimes, or people who, you know, if our children are friends with people who go to a worse school, for example, purely because of their level of wealth, that we look down on them for that. Or we don't spend as much time proactively with these people because we don't think we're going to benefit from them. And this is something that we want to avoid. And then he ends by saying that also their disdain for sitting with the poor. This is one of the biggest calamities that we seek protection from, right? We never want to be people that we look at someone who's in need and we ever look down on them. Right? And so another way to gauge this is that when we're giving, how often do we give with our own hands? Sometimes people, and this was sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, in fact, your zakah doesn't even count until it's dispersed. It's not about the money that you had held, but rather it's that, did you get it to its recipient? And one of the wisdoms and the ahkam in this is that you get to not only see the person, but that you humanize them, right? And that you get to spend time with them. You learn about their needs. You learn about who they actually are. And this was one of the biggest sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ that we've forgotten in the day and age where we just kind of drop money in the charity box, right? Or we just click a button online and our donations are given. But how often do we seek out actively people who are in need and sit with them? And we gave the example last time of Sayyidina Ali Zain al-Abidin, who was the great grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, who every night would go carrying bread on his back, seeking out people who needed food. To the point where he passed away, and then people realized afterwards how many people he fed because they all came out and they were in need of food that they never existed before. And so he is sharing that. And then he ends this by saying that arrogance is manifested in worldly things such as wealth, power, and status, despite the fact that the world is of less value to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the wing of a gnat, and in some narrations, than the wing of a mosquito. This is a hadith where we are told that if the dunya had any element of value, if it had even the value of the wing of a mosquito in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he wouldn't even give somebody who didn't believe in Allah a sip of water. Right? So if this world had any value to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he wouldn't have given it to anyone. And our teachers remind us that when it comes to the dunya, both the people who disbelieve in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the people who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they both have that. There's nothing special about it. Some people might have more, some people might have less, but when it comes to taqwa of Allah and consciousness of Allah, only select people have that. Most of the believers don't have that, and definitely none of the disbelievers have that. And so, this is something to remind us, right? That sometimes we look at people who are very clearly arrogant, and we see that they have lots of wealth around them. You see that they're successful, and you see people who believe and who are humble and modest and pious people who actually have the least of the dunya. And we say, how is it somebody who believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala treats them, and a person who disbelieves, he has so much of wealth. Right? But rather, that is not only arrogance, but it's also the wrong frame. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us so clearly that مَنْ كَانَ يُرِيدُ الْعَاجِلَةَ عَجَّلْنَا لَهُ فِيهَا مَا نَشَاءُ, that the people who want the dunya, we're going to give it to them. Right? It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's promise that if you want the dunya, and you seek that, He'll give that to you. لَهُ مَا نَشَاءُ لِمَنْ نُرِيدُ ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَا لَهُ جَهَنَّمْ, and that will also hasten for them Jahannam. Right? People who are basically sacrificing everything, who are being ignorant and heedless of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the dunya. They have no value to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَا جَهَنَّمْ يَصْلَاهَا مَذْمُومًا مَدْحُورًا وَمَنْ أَرَادَ الْآخِرَةَ وَسَعَى لَهَا سَعْيَهَا, and the people who desire the akhirah, then for them, we're going to also give them that, and that will also hasten that for them, and that is the more honorable thing to look for. And so we don't delude ourselves in thinking that, number one, because we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's going to give us the dunya. He can if He wants. And this is a promise of people who give zakat or sadaqah, that He'll return that to us in this life and in the next. But the point being is that your wealth is a test. And so sometimes if you don't have that, and your poverty is also a test. But wealth is actually, the ulama say, a more difficult test, because it's far harder for you to part with something that you know other people have value in. Right? And so you might say, I'm a zahid, I'm a person who doesn't care for wealth. I'm a person who doesn't care for the dunya. But the second you have that wealth, all of those things change. And many of us can attest to this, right? You might be a person who doesn't have that much, but the second you have it, you now have this added burden of thinking, okay, now what do I do with it? Right? Do I find a nicer house? Do I give it away? But if I give it away, could I have used it for something else? And all of these questions that are simply things that shaitan tempts us with. And if we didn't have that to begin with, then that burden, and that's what wealth is, it's a burden. And it could be used for good and it can be used for bad. But that we wouldn't be tempted with that. And so that is the way that we look to that. And that the world is too contemptible for people to show arrogance concerning it. Basically saying that the world has no value for someone to take pride in having it. He says that Fir'aun and Haman and Qarun, these are people in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَفِرْعَوْنَ وَهَامَانَ وَقَارُونَ وَقَالُوا سَاحِرٌ كَذَّابٌ, that these were the pharaohs of the time. And you go, we just had the opportunity to go to Cairo and to Egypt last year. And you look at, thousands of years ago, these massive pyramids that are still standing today. But they're only standing because people restore them, right? But even the massive buildings, if you let a building basically go even 10 years, less than that, without actively preserving it, it goes to decay. You look at places like Detroit, you look at places like anywhere in the world, places that were prosperous civilizations, that in a matter of just, whether it's decades or centuries or millennium, it's still a drop in the bucket in terms of the actual time that since the beginning of creation. And all of those massive civilizations where people thought that they had everything, and the kings of the world, how many tens of thousands of kings existed before us? And they had far more than us, right? They had far more of the world than us, and they had it, and now they don't have it anymore. It didn't benefit them, right? And how can we show arrogance when we know other people had far more of the world than us? And so it's not something to show arrogance for. And that he continues and he says that believers must therefore take the path of humility and attempt to attain it, even if it is just affectation at first, until it becomes firm in their hearts. So a person who believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they always look towards the path of humility. The first sign of someone who lacks taqwa of Allah, and it might be just because of their own nafs, their own lack of knowledge or understanding, is someone who is arrogant. Doesn't matter how much they pray. It doesn't matter what their status is in the community. The person who is arrogant has very little value in the eye of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And somebody asked this question recently, right? That what does it mean for a person who has even a mustard seed of arrogance or pride? to not enter Jannah, right? A mustard seed, like even just this little of arrogance, that is something that's going to prevent you from entering until you purify yourself of it, or until you go through a means of purification from it. And the means of purification in the akhirah is nothing other than Jahannam, and we ask for protection from that. But that is how severe it is. Arrogance and ignorance and pride is not something to take lightly. And then he says that even if it's just faking it at first, it's better to fake humility in an attempt to try to earn that trait, right? Not just faking it so other people think highly of you, but so that you can truly try to earn that character trait until it becomes firm in their heart. A believer should regard themselves to be the lowest of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation and the most needy of His servants, while fearing His power and His ability to punish them should He wish to do so. If this is their state, that they will not be shaken by events taking place around them, and they will continue to seek to attain humility. It's really powerful, right? Because how many times in our life that we regret actions that we've done, right? Sometimes we look at the things around us and we say that, I can't believe this happened. If I didn't do this, this would have happened. Or, when somebody, even somebody, for example, who you know to be a good person, they pass away in like a car accident. They say, how could this have happened to someone? And you're shaken. A person who's shaken by something, it's a natural response, but it's also a clear indicator that you don't have the proper understanding of the dunya. Because this happens on a daily basis. Like, for example, I was just looking at, I don't remember what spurred this, but basically there was some like police blotter or police report. I think we heard sirens or something. We were trying to figure out what was happening. You look at the police blotter or the dispatch radio in your locality, and you see literally within a mile to 2 miles around you that how many tens, even hundreds of people sometimes in the same city who are just around you, you see things happening like homicides or assaults or people passing away in car accidents, and we think that we're immune to this. And then you multiply that on a scale of hundreds and thousands of cities and then millions and billions of people. This is commonplace, right? Even you go to a place in a rural area, there's a reason that there are places like ERs or ICU unit that exist there. Those freak accidents that we call them happen on a regular basis, right? They're not irregular events. Even just last week that we saw, there was so many reports of 5 to 10 people that were struck by lightning, and we think that this doesn't happen. Right? This is a once in a, whatever the statistic is, once in a million chance, right? Or even I just read this week, right? Death Valley, which is one of the lowest points, right, in California, had its once in a, I can't remember, it was like once in 1,000 or once in a million year events. They just had 4 once in a million year events in the course of 2 weeks. Once in a million years, they had 4 times in every 2 weeks. So all of these statistics are just numbers, right? There are our best estimates to try to put sense to things, but they are not hard and fast rules, because ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the cause and He is the effect. If He wants the world to end tomorrow, it doesn't matter how much science is going to say that this is how much lifespan we have left on the earth. It doesn't matter how much CO2 or pollution or any of this stuff that they're going to tell us to say. Yes, these are gauges, they're measures, they're important, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that's in control. And so He says that a person who sees all these things, even the state of the world today, right, they don't not only lose hope, but they're not shaken by it. But rather our deen in its beauty gives us the perspective to, number one, know this is going to happen. These aren't surprises. They know how it's going to happen, and number two, it tells us how to react to it. And so this is from the beautiful wisdom and gift that we have that we don't want to lose sight of. They must emulate the Habib sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who he says that any of the slave, and he says slaves, and he also says any of the women, right, of Medina could call upon him and request that he speak to someone on their behalf, or buy something for them, or fulfill some need for them. This is so beautiful, subhanAllah, right? That anybody, even the lowest people of society, even the people that were basically, quote unquote, the shyest people, right? The women of society, had the ability to approach the Prophet ﷺ and ask him for anything it was that they needed. Which leader do you know today, whether it's your boss or whether it is even an imam in our community, that you have the ability to go to them and tell them, I'm in need of something, can you help me? Very few people you can do that with. And I was just thinking, even just a few days ago, we're moving soon. I was like, who can I call? Right? And I have, alhamdulillah, we're very blessed to have a lot of friends, a lot of family, but even then, I didn't feel comfortable asking them for help. And the Prophet ﷺ was somebody that he, ﷺ, out of his kindness and out of his humility towards people, anybody could approach him and anybody could ask him for anything. And so you ask yourself this, are you somebody who people can approach? Right? If somebody's too shy to ask you for money or for help, that means you're doing something wrong, right? You're a person who lacks that softness towards people because they think they're going to be judged. The people of his household, we talked about this hadith already before, that they were asked about his state and they said that, this is really funny, they said that he was like one of them in regard to household chores. That he was somebody, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would sweep and clean the house, he would patch his clothes, and he would carve and cut his meat when it came to cooking. But when it came time for the prayer, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he would leave the house as if he didn't know anybody in the house. And when it came time for salah, he left immediately. He was very diligent to adhering to it. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she says that we did not used to take undue notice of him. That when he entered the house, we weren't in awe of him, nor did we fear him, meaning there was a balance. And there are other narrations where we see, people like Abdullah bin Salam and other companions who say, I've never seen the likes of the Prophet ﷺ and his majesty. Right? But what the Aisha radiallahu anha is saying is that even despite being his wives, that none of them saw him as somebody who carried himself with haughtiness, right? Somebody who carried himself with pride. That he even walked with humility in his own home. Except, and she says, the exception was a lamb which used to live in the house and it used to come and go, but if the Prophet ﷺ entered it, it would sit in the corner and remain motionless until he went out. Right? So that the lamb, because it was an animal, that this was somebody who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed in its heart and in its character that he was saying that in his heart and in his character, that even the lamb had reverence for the Prophet ﷺ, right? The lamb, and all of these, and we see so many reports and narrations of this from multiple different people, that even the animals were constantly in awe and in reverence of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is from his divine grace that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon him. And this, he continues and he says that this is how he trains his companions, that there was no shame or disgrace in him wearing in them wearing patched clothes. Right? Sometimes some of them were rich, some of them were poor. And the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't care what they wore, he didn't care what they had, he only cared what they had in their hearts. And we learn about this example even from Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, that there was a time after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, that when he was a Khalifa, he was observed going to an older woman's home. There was a blind woman, and he would take care of her needs before he became a ruler and after he became a ruler. Right? Because even when he was a Khalifa, he didn't want to make it seem as if he was above the people. And so that this was somebody, and I believe Umar radiallahu anh, he would constantly see him visiting this woman's house. And so he's like, I have to see what he's doing. Right? Why is he going to this woman's house? And he goes and he says, who's the person that comes, right, to your house? What is he doing here? And she says, I don't know who he is, right, because she's blind. But he takes care of, he cooks for me, he milks, the goats or the cows, and he takes care of all of my needs, and then he leaves. And he's been doing this every single day. And Umar radiallahu anh, he recognizes that this is from the humility of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, and from no other, from no other person that he learned from except the Prophet ﷺ. And he continues and he says that if we are proud of our good health, that we should realize that it could be lost by the slightest pain in our teeth, that it could be lost by the slightest pain in our eyes or in our ears. And if we boast about our wealth, that we should realize in an instant we may become penniless. So people who think that they have anything, whether you're healthy now, the Prophet ﷺ, he tells us this, right? He says that make use of 5 things before they are taken away from you. And whether some of this is your time before your busyness, your health, your youth before your old age, you have your wealth before your poverty. And these are things that the Prophet ﷺ is telling us very clearly about out of his wisdom ﷺ. And we know people sometimes in our own community, right? One of my beloved teachers was telling me this, that there was somebody who saved all of his life, right, for his retirement. And everyone does this, at least in the US, because of the systems that we have in place. And all of this wealth that he worked 50, 60, 70 years to earn, that he was then scammed from it in an instant. And you have other people who, there'll be the millionaires and the billionaires, and you give it just one moment, one market event happens, or some life event happens, or somebody sues them, right? And they lose everything. And so all of these things are arbitrary, right? We don't put value in the things that we have. All we say is that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us something, that we show shukr and gratitude for it, and that we recognize He can take it away at any given moment. Right? And that is what humility is. That we never ever define ourselves and our character and our akhlaq and our self-worth. Right? Sometimes people place their self-worth in their degrees, or they place their self-worth in their wealth, or they place their self-worth in the person that they marry. And these are all silly things, right? All of these things can be removed from you. Give it I was going to say one moment, but even half a lifetime, even less than that. And you see the people around you, they lose all of those things. It doesn't have any inherent value. As we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for protection from any calamity, we ask Him for barakah and His true blessing and happiness and contentment in the way that we live our lives and the things that we possess and the intentions that we make for those things. And we ask Him to increase us in anything that brings us closer to Him, and protection from anything that keeps us away from Him. In this next chapter, the author continues on the chapter of zuhd, right? Abstinence. Inshallah, do you want to read that?
Messenger of Allah
A little bit louder.
The Messenger of Allah mentioned 3 matters connected to the character of a Muslim and swore an oath concerning them. He said, "There are 3 things about which I swear an oath, that the more forgiving a person becomes, the more he increases in nobility. That charity does not decrease a person's wealth, and that whenever someone opens upon himself the door of asking from others, Allah opens for him the door of poverty."
We'll pause there, right? There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that he says, there are 3 things about which I swear an oath. Now when the Prophet ﷺ swears an oath, that means, right, listen up, right? Because it's something that's serious. And he's saying that a person who forgives, the more forgiving a person becomes, that he increases in nobility. Sometimes we think the opposite. We think we forgive someone, that all of a sudden we give them, an upper hand over us. He says there is nothing that you're not going to lower yourself by any means by forgiving someone, but rather the opposite. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will raise you from that. Because what does it take to forgive someone? It takes lowering yourself in front of them. Inshallah, we'll conclude after Maghrib. Inshallah. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.